The precinct was tense, a static electricity buzzing in the air like everyone could feel a storm coming but couldn't name it yet. And as I sat in a cold holding room, uncuffed now but no less insulted, I waited, shoulders square, fingers folded, fury buried beneath a calm so precise it could cut through arrogance like a clean bullet through glass. And I wasn't waiting for justice, because I've learned justice doesn't arrive uninvited. I was waiting for consequence, and I knew the second that door swung open, I'd hear its footsteps. And then came the sound, not the nervous shuffle of an apologetic officer or the forced charm of a PR-trained lieutenant, but the deliberate steel-tempered stride of someone who didn't have to announce their authority because it lived in every step. And when I turned and saw the crisp uniform, the silver clusters, and the eagle-eyed glare of none other than General Langston Royce, I knew something seismic had shifted, because the last time I saw him, I was receiving the Navy Cross, and now here he was, standing in a city precinct, surrounded by frozen officers who suddenly remembered their place in the chain of command. And the first words out of his mouth weren't for show, weren't rehearsed. They were for me. "Chief Harris, I heard what happened. You were disrespected. That ends now." And the silence that followed was devastating, because no one had anything to say, not even the cops who'd dragged me in, now pale-faced and rigid. And General Royce turned to them, slow and precise, and said, "You handcuffed a decorated Navy sniper. You ignored military ID. You treated a warfighter like a criminal for walking home." And then he laid into them, not with shouting, but with surgical force, demanding names, badge numbers, camera footage, full chain of custody reports, calling in internal affairs and telling the precinct captain directly, "Every officer in this building is going through bias retraining, starting today." And I sat there listening, not smiling, because this wasn't a victory lap. It was a reckoning, and when Royce finally turned back to me, something in his face softened, not because I was fragile, but because he saw the toll this had taken, and he said, "You didn't deserve this, Chief. You earned more than this, and I'm going to make sure you get it." And true to his word, the fallout began that very hour. Both officers suspended, a formal apology issued, and a press conference held where my record was read aloud with the reverence it deserved, not as a defense but as a declaration. And when I stepped out of that precinct beside General Royce, the same people who had filmed my humiliation now watched my vindication, and someone asked, "How does it feel to be free?" And I responded, "With the same steel they tried to strip from me. I've always been free. They just didn't know who they were dealing with." And later that week, standing in full-dress blues before a naval tribunal, not for my behavior, but theirs, I testified not with bitterness, but purpose, because this wasn't just about me. It was about every soldier, every woman, every person of color who served and been disrespected, and I made it clear, I won't let this be swept away. Not for me. Not for the next one. And as I exited that courtroom, I wasn't thinking about revenge or headlines. I was thinking about the kid who might see my story and learn that sometimes justice doesn't wear a badge, but it does wear stars, and sometimes it walks through the door right when you need it most. The minutes ticked by in that holding room like they were trying to choke me, sterile walls closing in tighter with every breath, my wrists still red from the cuffs that shouldn't have ever touched me, my mind a tight coil of fury, fatigue, and the steady discipline that years of military life had carved into my bones, because while they thought I was just another suspect waiting to crack, they didn't know I'd spent 15 years tracking targets under pressure in worse conditions than this, where the cost of flinching was life or death, not bruised pride. And so I sat there upright, unmoving, even as two rookie officers peeked through the glass, pretending not to gawk, their curiosity too loud, their ignorance even louder, and then suddenly everything shifted, not because I moved, but because the air outside thickened, the way it does right before a sandstorm hits, and I knew instinctively that someone powerful had entered the building, not because they were loud, but because their presence reshaped the room. And a moment later, the door creaked open with the kind of reverent slowness that only happens when the people outside no longer feel in charge. And there he was, General Langston Royce, 4-star battlefield-tested, spine like steel, eyes like winter, The man who once pinned a medal to my chest in Afghanistan and told me I made the country proud. And the second he stepped into that room, it wasn't the police precincts anymore, it was his. And the tension among the officers crackled so loudly you could almost hear their careers flashing before their eyes. Because they didn't just see a general, they saw judgment, consequence, and legacy wrapped in one towering figure. And he didn't even look at them at first. He looked at me, held my gaze, and said with the quiet force of a man who'd led troops through war zones, "Chief Harris, I was briefed. This is unacceptable. You were wronged. And I came to say that to your face, and just like that the balance of power shifted. Not back to me, not yet, but away from them. And that was enough to start the process of setting it all right." Because now General Royce turned slowly, methodically, toward the supervising officer. And what came next wasn't yelling. It was surgical demolition. You placed a decorated Navy sniper in cuffs. You ignored her credentials. You humiliated someone who has given more for this country than you've ever imagined giving. And with each word, his voice didn't rise. It sharpened, like a blade scraping through every excuse, every deflection, until there was nothing left but shame and silence. And then came the orders, precise and lethal. Full internal review, body cam footage secured, the 2 arresting officers placed on immediate administrative leave, and a directive sent straight to the police chief's office mandating department-wide training on veteran identification, implicit bias, and civil-military respect protocols. Yes, protocols. Because what happened to me was more than a mistake. It was a systemic failure. And the general wasn't about to let it pass like bad weather, not on his watch. And when he finally turned back to me, his voice dropped just enough for the others not to hear, and he said, "Amani, I know this cut deeper than they'll ever understand, but the whole damn command chain's going to hear about it now." And I could have broken down in that moment, because it wasn't just that someone finally believed me, it was that someone powerful cared enough to act publicly, loudly, with force, and not for press, not for performance, but because he knew what it meant to see one of his own treated like disposable equipment. And when I walked out of that room beside him, every officer we passed stood like they'd been snapped into attention, their faces a cocktail of confusion and dread. And outside the precinct, the crowd that had gathered, many who had watched me be cuffed just hours earlier, parted silently. As I stepped into the daylight not as a suspect, but as a soldier reclaimed, vindicated, respected, and someone started clapping. Not many, but enough to make the others join. And as the sound grew louder, I realized that the humiliation they tried to bury me with had instead become a signal flare, lighting up something bigger than my own pain, because what happened to me was never just about me. And when a young black girl broke through the edge of the crowd, ran up to me and asked, "Are you really in the Navy?" I knelt, looked her in the eyes and said, "Yes, and you can be too. Don't let anyone tell you what you're worth." And that's when I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the start of a new mission, because I wasn't going to let what happened to me disappear into a file drawer. I was going to speak about it, write about it, show up for every vet, every woman, every person of color who wears the uniform and deserves better than silence. And with the general's support, we launched an initiative within weeks, Operation Honor Back, a military-civilian campaign to train departments nationwide in veteran recognition and unconscious bias response. And while the road was long, the message was clear. Never again would a soldier in this country be shamed in silence, not on our soil, not on our watch. And as for me, I'm still serving, still sharp, still steady. But now I carry more than a rifle. I carry a story, a cause, and the unwavering truth that justice once earned doesn't beg, it demands.